Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The third episode of Vathek, by Clark Ashton Smith. Vathek was connected to the mythos by Clark Ashton Smith in The Ghoul. The story of the Princess Sulkais and the Prince Kalila. My father, Lord, can scarcely be unknown to you, inasmuch as the Caliph Motassem had entrusted to his care the fertile province of Masr. Nor would he have been unworthy of his exalted position if, in view of man's ignorance and weakness, an inordinate desire to control the future were not to be accounted an unpardonable error. The Emir Abu Tahir Ahmed, however, for such was my father's name, was very far from recognizing this truth. Only too often did he seek to forestall providence, and to direct the course of events in spite of the decrees of heaven. Ah! Terrible indeed are those decrees. Sooner or later their accomplishment is sure. Vainly do we seek to oppose them. During a long course of years, everything flourished under my father's rule, and among the emirs who have successfully administered that beautiful province, Abu Tahir Ahmed will not be forgotten. Following his speculative bent, he enlisted the services of certain experienced Nubians, born near the sources of the Nile, who had studied the stream throughout its course, and knew all its characteristics, and the properties of its waters, and with their aid, he carried out his impious design of regulating the overflow of the river. Thus he covered the country with a too luxuriant vegetation, which left it afterwards exhausted. The people, always slaves to outward appearances, applauded his enterprises, worked indefatigably at the unnumbered canals with which he intersected the land, and blinded by his successes, passed lightly over any unfortunate circumstances accompanying them. If, out of every 10 ships that he sent forth to traffic, according to his fancy, a single ship came back richly freighted after a successful voyage, the wreck of the other 9 was counted for nothing. Moreover, as, owing to his care and vigilance, commerce prospered under his rule, he was himself deceived as to his losses, and took to himself all the glory of his gains. Soon Abu Tahir Ahmed came to be convinced that if he could recover the arts and sciences of the ancient Egyptians, his power would be unbounded. He believed that, in the remote ages of antiquity, men had appropriated to their own use some rays of the divine wisdom, and thus been enabled to work marvels, and he did not despair of bringing back once again that glorious time. For this purpose he caused search to be made, among the ruins abounding in the country, for the mysterious tablets which, according to the report of the sages who swarmed in his court, would show how the arts and sciences in question were to be acquired, and also indicate the means of discovering hidden treasures, and subduing the intelligences by which those treasures were guarded. Never before his time had any Mussulman puzzled his brains over hieroglyphics. Now, however, search was made on his behalf for hieroglyphics of every kind, in all quarters, in the remotest provinces, the strange symbols being faithfully copied on linen cloths. I have seen these cloths 1,000 times, stretched out on the roofs of our palace. Nor could bees be more busy and assiduous about a bed of flowers than were the sages about these painted sheets. But as each sage entertained a different opinion as to the meaning of what was there depicted, arguments were frequent, and quarrels ensued. Not only did the sages spend the hours of daylight in prosecuting their researches, but the moon often shed its beams upon them while so occupied. They did not dare to light torches upon the terrace roofs, for fear of alarming the faithful Mussulmans, who were beginning to blame my father's veneration for an idolatrous antiquity, and regarded all these painted symbols, these figures, with a pious horror. Meanwhile, the Emir, who would never have thought of neglecting any real matter of business however unimportant, for the pursuit of his strange studies, was by no means so particular with regard to his religious observances, and often forgot to perform the ablutions ordained by the law. The women of his harem did not fail to perceive this, but were afraid to speak, as, for one reason and another, their influence had considerably waned. But on a certain day, Shaban, the chief of the eunuchs, who was very old and very pious, presented himself before his master, holding a ewer and golden basin, and said, "The waters of the Nile have been given for the cleansing of all our impurities. Their source is in the clouds of heaven, not in the temples of idols. Take and use those waters, for you stand in need of them." The emir, duly impressed by the action and speech of Shaban, yielded to his just remonstrances, and instead of unpacking a large bale of painted cloths, which had just arrived from a far distance, ordered the eunuch to serve the day's collation in the hall of the golden trellises, and to assemble there all his slaves, and all his birds, of which he kept a large number in aviaries of sandalwood. Immediately the palace rang to the sound of instruments of music, and groups of slaves appeared, all dressed in their most attractive garments, and each leading in leash a peacock whiter than snow. One only of these slaves, whose slender and graceful form was a delight to the eye, had no bird in leash, and kept her veil down. "Why this eclipse?" said the emir to Shaban. "Lord," answered he with joyful mien, "I am better than all your astrologers, for it is I who have discovered this lovely star. But do not imagine that she is yet within your reach. Her father, the holy and venerable Imam Abzendaroud, will never consent to make you happy in the possession of her charms unless you perform your ablutions with greater regularity, and give the go-by to the sages and their hieroglyphics." My father, without replying to Shaban, ran to snatch away the veil that hid the countenance of Galendi Begum, for such was the name of Abzendaroud's daughter, and he did so with such violence that he nearly crushed 2 peacocks, and overturned several baskets of flowers. To this sudden heat succeeded a kind of ecstatic stupor. At last he cried, "How beautiful she is, how divine! Go, fetch at once the Imam of Sisif, let the nuptial chamber be got ready, and all necessary preparations for our marriage be complete within 1 hour." "But, Lord," said Shaban, in consternation, "you forget that Galendi Begum cannot marry you without the consent of her father, who makes it a condition that you should abandon." "What nonsense are you talking?" interrupted the emir. "Do you think I am fool enough not to prefer this young virgin, fresh as the dew of the morning, to cartloads of hieroglyphics, moldy and of the color of dead ashes? As to Abzendaroud, go and fetch him if you like, but quickly, for I shall certainly not wait a moment longer than I please." "Hasten, Shaban," said Galendi Begum modestly, "hasten. You see that I am not here in case to make any very effectual resistance." "It's my fault," mumbled the eunuch as he departed, "but I shall do what I can to rectify my error." Accordingly he flew to find Abzendaroud. But that faithful servant of Allah had gone from home very early in the morning, and sought the open fields in order to pursue his pious investigations into the growth of plants and the life of insects. A death-like pallor overspread his countenance when he saw Shaban swooping down upon him like a raven of ill omen, and heard him tell, in broken accents, how the emir had promised nothing, and how he himself might well arrive too late to exact the pious conditions he had so deeply pondered. Nevertheless, the Imam did not lose courage, and reached my father's palace in a very few moments. But unfortunately he was by this time so out of breath that he sank down on a sofa, and remained for over an hour panting and breathless. While all the eunuchs were doing their best to revive the holy man, Shaban had quickly gone up to the apartment assigned to Abu Tahir Ahmed's pleasures. But his zeal suffered some diminution when he saw the door guarded by 2 black eunuchs, who, brandishing their sabers, informed him that if he ventured to take one more step forward, his head would roll at his own feet. Therefore he had nothing better to do than to return to Abzendaroud, whose gaspings he regarded with wild and troubled eyes, lamenting the while over his own imprudence in bringing Galendi Begum within the emir's power. Notwithstanding the care my father was taking for the entertainment of the new sultana, he had heard something of the dispute between the black eunuchs and Shaban, and had a fair notion of what was going on. As soon, therefore, as he judged it convenient, he came to find Abzendaroud in the hall of the golden trellises, and presenting Galendi Begum to the holy man assured him that, while awaiting his arrival, he, the emir, had made her his wife. At these words, the Imam uttered a lamentable and piercing cry, which relieved the pressure on his chest, and rolling his eyes in a fearful manner, he said to the new sultana, "Wretched woman, dost thou not know that rash and ill-considered acts lead ever to a miserable end? Thy father would have made thy lot secure, but thou hast not awaited the result of his efforts, or rather it is heaven itself that mocks all human previsions. I ask nothing more of the Emir. Let him deal with thee, and with his hieroglyphics, as he deems best. I foresee untold evils in the future, but I shall not be there to witness them. Rejoice for a while, intoxicated with thy pleasures. As for me, I call to my aid the angel of death, and hope, within 3 days, to rest in peace in the bosom of our great prophet." After saying these words, he rose to his feet, tottering. His daughter strove in vain to hold him back. He tore his robe from her trembling hands. She fell fainting to the ground, and while the distracted Emir was striving to bring her back again to her senses, the obstinate Abzendaroud went muttering from the room. At first it was thought that the holy man would not keep his vow quite literally, and would suffer himself to be comforted, but such was not the case. On reaching his own house, he began by stopping his ears by cotton wool, so as not to hear the clamor and adjuration of his friends, and then, having seated himself on the mats in his cell, with his legs crossed, and his head in his hands, he remained in that posture speechless, and taking no food, and finally, at the end of 3 days, expired according to his prayer. He was buried magnificently, and during the obsequies Shaban did not fail to manifest his grief by slashing his flesh without mercy, and soaking the earth with little rivulets of his blood, after which, having caused balm to be applied to his wounds, he returned to the duties of his office. Meanwhile, the Emir had no small difficulty in assuaging the despair of Galendi Begum, and often cursed the hieroglyphics which had been its first efficient cause. At last his attentions touched the heart of the Sultana. She regained her ordinary equability of spirits, and became pregnant, and everything returned to its accustomed order. The Emir, his mind always dwelling on the magnificence of the ancient pharaohs, built, after their manner, a palace with 12 pavilions, proposing, at an early date, to install in each pavilion a son. Unfortunately, his wives brought forth nothing but daughters. At each new birth he grumbled, gnashed his teeth, accused Muhammad of being the cause of his mishaps, and would have been altogether unbearable, if Galendi Begum had not found means to moderate his evil temper. She induced him to come every night into her apartment, where, by 1,000 ingenious devices, she succeeded in introducing fresh air, while, in other parts of the palace, the atmosphere was stifling. During her pregnancy my father never left the dais on which she reclined. This dais was set on a large and long gallery overlooking the Nile, and so disposed as to seem about on a level with the stream, so close, too, that anyone reclining upon it could throw into the water the seeds of any pomegranate he might be eating. The best dancers, the most excellent magicians, were always about the palace. Every night pantomimes were performed to the light of 1,000 golden lamps placed upon the floor so as to bring out the fineness and grace of the performers' feet. The dancers themselves cost my father immense sums in golden-fringed slippers and sandals glitter with jewelry, and indeed, when they were all in motion together the effect was dazzling. But notwithstanding this accumulation of splendors, the Sultana passed very unhappy days on her dais. With the same indifference that a poor wretch tormented by sleeplessness watches the scintillations of the stars, so did she see pass before her eyes all this whirl of performers in their brilliancy and charm. Anon she would think of the wrath, that seemed almost prophetic, of her venerable father, anon she would deplore his strange and untimely end. 1,000 times she would interrupt the choir of singers, crying, "Fate has decreed my ruin. Heaven will not vouchsafe me a son, and my husband will banish me from his sight." The torment of her mind intensified the pain and discomfort attendant on her condition. My father, thereupon, was so greatly perturbed that, for the first time in his life, he made appeal to heaven, and ordered prayers to be offered up in every mosque. Nor did he omit the giving of alms, for he caused it to be publicly announced that all beggars were to assemble in the largest court of the palace, and would there be served with rice, each according to his individual appetite. There followed such a crush every morning at the palace gates that the incomers were nearly suffocated. Mendicants swarmed in from all parts, by land and by river. Whole villages would come down the stream on rafts. And the appetites of all were enormous, for the buildings which my father had erected, his costly pursuit of hieroglyphics, and his maintenance of the sages, had caused some scarcity throughout the land. Among those who came from a very far distance was a man of an extreme age, and great singularity, by name Abu Gab el-Gayman, the hermit of the great sandy desert. He was 8 feet high, so ill-proportioned, and of a leanness so extreme, that he looked like a skeleton, and was hideous to behold. Nevertheless, this lugubrious and forbidden piece of human mechanism enshrined the most benevolent and religious spirit in the universe. With a voice of thunder he proclaimed the will of the Prophet, and said openly it was a pity that a prince who distributed rice to the poor, and in such great profusion, should be a lover of hieroglyphics. People crowded around him. The imams, the mullahs, the muezzins did nothing but sing his praises. His feet, though ingrained with the sand of his native desert, were freely kissed. Nay, the very grains of the sand from his feet were gathered up, and treasured in caskets of amber. One day he proclaimed the truth and the horror of the sciences of evil, in a voice so loud and resonant that the great standard set before the palace trembled. The terrible sound penetrated into the interior of the harem. The women and the eunuchs fainted away in the hall of the golden trellises. The dancers stood with one foot arrested in the air. The mummers had not the courage to pursue their antics. The musicians suffered their instruments to fall to the ground, and Galendi Begum thought to die of fright as she lay on her dais. Abu Tahir Ahmed stood astounded. His conscience smote him for his idolatrous proclivities, and during a few remorseful moments he thought that the avenging angel had come to turn him into stone, and not himself only but the people committed to his charge. After standing for some time, upright, with arms uplifted, in the gallery of the daïses, he called Shaban to him, and said, "The sun has not lost its brightness, the Nile flows peacefully in its bed, what means then this supernatural cry that has just resounded through my palace?" "Lord," answered the pious eunuch, "this voice is the voice of truth, and is spoken to you through the mouth of the venerable Abu Gab el-Gayman, the hermit of the sandy desert, the most faithful, the most zealous, of the servants of the Prophet, who has, in 9 days, journeyed 300 leagues to make proof of your hospitality, and to impart to you the knowledge with which he is inspired. Do not neglect the teachings of a man who in wisdom, in piety, and in stature surpasses the most enlightened, the most devout, and the most gigantic of the inhabitants of earth. All your people are in an ecstasy. Trade is at a standstill. The inhabitants of the city hasten to hear him, neglecting their wonted assemblies in the public gardens. The storytellers are without hearers at the margins of the public fountains. Yusuf himself was not wiser than he, and had no greater knowledge of the future." At these last words, the emir was suddenly smitten with the desire of consulting Abu Gabel with regard to his family affairs, and particularly with regard to the great projects he entertained for the future advantage of his sons, who were not yet born. He deemed himself happy in being thus able to consult a living prophet, for, so far, it was only in the form of mummies that he had been brought into relation with these inspired personages. He resolved, therefore, to summon into his presence, nay, into his very harem, the extraordinary being now in question. Would not the pharaohs have so dealt with the necromancers of their time, and was not he determined, in all circumstances, to follow the pharaoh's example? He therefore graciously directed Shaban to go and fetch the holy man. Shaban, transported with joy, hastened to communicate this invitation to the hermit, who, however, did not appear to be as much charmed by the summons as were the people at large. These latter filled the air with their acclamations, while Abu Gabel stood still, with his hands clasped, and his eyes uplifted to heaven, in a prophetic trance. From time to time he uttered the deepest sighs, and after, remaining long wrapped in holy contemplation, shouted out, in his voice of thunder, "Allah's will be done. I am but his creature." Eunuch, I am ready to follow thee. But let the doors of the palace be broken down. It is not meet for the servants of the Most High to bend their heads." The people needed no second command. They all set hands to the work with a will, and in an instant the gateway, a piece of the most admirable workmanship, was utterly ruined. At the sound of the breaking in of the doors, piercing cries arose within the harem. Abu Tahir Ahmed began to repent of his curiosity. Nevertheless, he ordered, though somewhat reluctantly, that the passages into the harem should be laid open to the holy giant, for he feared lest the enthusiastic adherents of the Prophet should penetrate into the apartments occupied by the women, and containing the princely treasures. These fears were, however, vain, for the holy man had sent back his devout admirers. "I have been assured that on their all kneeling to receive his blessing," he said to them, in tones of the deepest solemnity, "retire, remain peacefully in your dwellings, and be assured that, whatever happens, Abu Gabd al-Gayman is prepared for every emergency." Then, turning towards the palace, he cried, "O domes of dazzling brilliancy, receive me, and may nothing ensue to tarnish your splendor." Meanwhile, everything had been made ready within the harem. Screens had been duly ordered, the door curtains had been drawn, and ample draperies hung before the daïses in the long gallery that ran round the interior of the building, thus concealing from view the sultanas, and the princesses, their daughters. Such elaborate preparations had caused a general ferment, and curiosity was at its height, when the hermit, trampling underfoot the ruined fragments of the doorways, entered majestically into the hall of the golden trellises. The magnificence of the palace did not even win from him a passing glance. His eyes remained fixed, mournfully, on the pavement at his feet. At last he penetrated into the great gallery of the women. These latter, who were not at all accustomed to the sight of creatures so lean, gaunt, and gigantic, uttered piercing cries, and loudly asked for essences and cordials to enable them to bear up against the apparition of such a phantasm. The hermit paid not the smallest heed to the surrounding tumult. He was gravely pursuing his way, when the emir came forward, and taking him by the skirt of his garment, led him, with much ceremony, to the dais of the gallery which looked out upon the Nile. Basins of comfits and orthodox liquors were at once served, but though Abu Gabd al-Gayman seemed to be dying of hunger, he refused to partake of these refreshments, saying that for 90 years he had drunk nothing but the dew of heaven, and eaten only the locusts of the desert. The emir, who regarded this diet as conformable to what might properly be expected of a prophet, did not press him further, but at once entered into the question he had at heart, saying how much it grieved him to be without a male heir, notwithstanding all the prayers offered up to that effect, and the flattering hopes which the imams had given him. "But now," he continued, "I am assured that this happiness will at last be mine. The sages, the mediciners, predict it, and my own observations confirm their prognostications. It is not, therefore, with the purpose of consulting you with regard to the future that I have caused you to be summoned. It is for the purpose of obtaining your advice upon the education I should give to the son whose birth I am expecting, or rather, to the 2 sons, for, without doubt, in recognition of my alms, heaven will accord to the Sultana Galendi Begum a double measure of fertility, seeing that she is twice as large as women usually are on such occasions." Without answering a word, the hermit mournfully shook his head 3 times. My father, greatly astonished, asked if his anticipated good fortune was in any wise displeasing to the holy man. "Ah, too blind prince," replied the hermit, uttering a cavernous sigh that seemed to issue from the grave itself, "why importune heaven with rash prayers? Respect its decrees. It knows what is best for all men better than they do themselves. Woe be to you, and woe be to the son whom you will doubtless compel to follow in the perverse ways of your own beliefs, instead of submitting himself humbly to the guidance of Providence. If the great of this world could only foresee all the misfortunes they bring upon themselves, they would tremble in the midst of their splendor." Pharaoh recognized this truth, but too late. He pursued the children of Musa in despite of the divine decrees, and died the death of the wicked. What can alms avail when the heart is in rebellion? Instead of asking the prophet for an heir, to be led by you into the paths of destruction. Those who have your welfare at heart should implore him to cause Galendi Begum to die, yes, to die before she brings into the world presumptuous creatures, whom your conduct will precipitate into the abyss. Once again I call upon you to submit. If Allah's angel threatens to cut short the days of the Sultana, do not make appeal to your magicians to ward off the fatal blow. Let it fall, let her die. Tremble not with wrath, Amir, harden not your heart. Once again call to mind the fate of Pharaoh and the waters that swallowed him up. Call them to mind yourself, cried my father, foaming with rage, and springing from the dais to run to the aid of the Sultana, who, having heard all, had fainted away behind the curtains. Remember that the Nile flows beneath these windows, and that thou hast well deserved that thy odious carcass should be hurled into its waters. I fear not, cried the gigantic hermit in turn. The Prophet of Allah fears naught but himself, and he rose on the tips of his toes and touched with his hands the supports of the dome of the apartment. Ha! Ha! Thou fearest nothing, cried all the women and eunuchs, issuing like tigers out of their den. Accursed assassin, thou hast just brought our beloved mistress to death's door, and yet fearest nothing. Go, and become food for the monsters of the river. Screaming out these words, they threw themselves, all at once, on Abu Gabd al-Gayman, bore him down, strangled him without pity, and cast his body through a dark grating into the Nile, which there lost itself obscurely among the piers of iron. The Emir, astonished by an act at once so sudden and so atrocious, remained with his eyes fixed on the waters, but the body did not again come to the surface, and Shaban, who now appeared upon the scene, bewildered him with his cries. At last he turned to look upon the perpetrators of the crime, but they had scattered in every direction, and hidden behind the curtains of the gallery, each avoiding the other. They were all overwhelmed by the thought of what they had done. Galendi, who had only come to herself in time to witness this scene of horror, was now in mortal anguish. Her convulsions, her agonizing cries, drew the Emir to her side. He bedewed her hand with tears. She opened her eyes wildly, and cried, "O Allah! Allah! Put an end to a wretched creature who has already lived only too long, since she has been the cause of so terrible an outrage, and suffer not that she should bring into the world." "Stop, stop," interrupted the Emir, holding her hands which she was about to turn against herself. "Thou shalt not die, and my children shall yet live to give the lie to that demented skeleton, worthy only of contempt. Let my sages be summoned instantly. Let them use all their art to keep thy soul from flitting hence, and to save from harm the fruit of thy body." The sages were convened accordingly. They demanded that one of the courts in the palace should be placed entirely at their disposal, and there began their operations, kindling a fire whose light penetrated into the gallery. The Sultana rose from her couch, notwithstanding all the efforts made to restrain her, and ran to the balcony overlooking the Nile. The view from thence was lonely and drear. Not a single boat showed upon the surface of the stream. In the distance were discernible reaches of sand which the wind, from time to time, sent whirling into the air. The rays of the setting sun dyed the waters blood red. Scarcely had the deepening twilight stretched over the horizon, when a sudden and furious wind broke the open lattice-work of the gallery. The Sultana, beside herself, her heart beating, tried to plunge back into the interior of the apartment, but an irresistible power held her where she was, and forced her, against her will, to contemplate the mournful scene before her eyes. A great silence now reigned. Darkness had insensibly covered the earth. Then suddenly a streak of blue light furrowed the clouds in the direction of the pyramids. The princess could distinguish their enormous mass against the horizon as clearly as if it had been noonday. The spectacle thus suddenly revealed chilled her with fear. Several times did she try to call her slaves, but her voice refused its office. She endeavored to clap her hands, but in vain. While she remained thus, as if in the grip of some horrible dream, a lamentable voice broke into the stillness, and uttered these words: "My latest breath has just been exhaled into the waters of the river. vainly have thy servants striven to stifle the voice of truth. It rises now from the abysses of death. O wretched mother! See whence issues that fatal light, and tremble. Galendi Begum endured to hear no more. She fell back senseless. Her women, who had been anxious about her, hurried up at this moment, and uttered the most piercing cries. The sages approached, and placed into the hands of my father, who was in terrible perturbation, the powerful elixir they had prepared. Scarcely had a few drops fallen on the Sultana's breast, when her soul, which had seemed about to follow the orders of Azrael, the angel of death, came back, as if in nature's despite, to reanimate her body. Her eyes reopened to see, still illumining the pyramids, the fatal furrow of blue light which had not yet faded from the sky. She raised her arms, and pointing out to the Emir with her finger that dread portent, was seized with the pains of childbirth, and in the paroxysm of an unspeakable anguish, brought into the world a son and a daughter, the two wretched beings you see before you here. The Emir's joy in the possession of a male child was greatly dashed when he saw my mother die before his eyes. Notwithstanding his excessive grief, however, he did not lose his head, and at once handed us over to the care of his sages. The nurses, who had been engaged in great number, wished to oppose this arrangement, but the ancient men, all uttering incantations simultaneously, compelled them to silence. The cabalistic lavers in which we were to be immersed stood already prepared. The mixture of herbs exhaled a vapor that filled the whole palace. Shidhan, whose very stomach was turned by the odor of these unspeakable drugs, had all the trouble in the world to restrain himself from summoning the imams and doctors of the law, in order to oppose the impious rites now in contemplation. Would to heaven he had had the courage to do so! Ah, how terrible has been the influence upon us of the pernicious immersions to which we were then subjected! In short, Lord, we were plunged, both successively and together, into a hellbroth which was intended to impart to us a strength and intelligence more than human, but has only instilled into our veins the ardent elixir of a too exquisite sensibility, and the poison of an insatiable desire. It was to the sound of brazen wands beating against the metal sides of the lavers, it was in the midst of thick fumes issuing from heaps of burning herbs, that invocations were addressed to the jinns, and specially to those who preside over the pyramids, in order that we might be endowed with miraculous gifts. After this we were delivered over to the nurses, who scarcely could hold us in their arms, such was our liveliness and vivacity. The good women shed tears when they saw how our young blood boiled within us, and strove in vain to cool its effervescence, and to calm us by cleansing our bodies from the reeking mess with which they were still covered. But alas! The harm was already done. Nay, if even, as sometimes happened in after days, we wished to fall into the ordinary ways of childhood, my father, who was determined at all hazards to possess children of an extraordinary nature, would brisk us up with heating drugs and the milk of negresses. We thus became unendurably headstrong and meddlesome. At the age of 7, we could not bear contradiction. At the slightest restraint, we uttered cries of rage, and bit those who had us in charge till the blood flowed. Shaban came in for a large share of out attentions in this kind, sighing over us, however, in silence, for the Emir only regarded our spitefulness as giving evidence of a genius equal to that of Sorid and Karob. Ah! How little did anyone suspect the real cause of our forwardness! Those who look long into the light are soonest afflicted with blindness. My father had not yet remarked that we were never arrogant and overbearing towards one another, that each was ready to yield to the other's wishes, that Khalila, my brother, was never at peace save in my arms, and that, as for me, my only happiness lay in overwhelming him with caresses. Up to this time, we had in all things been educated together. The same book was always placed before the eyes of both, each turned over the leaves alternately. Though my brother was subjected to a course of study rigorous, and above his years, I insisted on sharing it with him. Abu Tahir Ahmed, who cared for nothing save the aggrandizement of his son, gave directions that in this I should be humored, because he saw that his son would only fully exert himself when at my side. We were taught not only the history of the most remote ages of antiquity, but also the geography of distant lands. The sages never ceased to indoctrinate us with the abstruse and ideal moral code, which, as they pretended, lurked hidden in the hieroglyphics. They filled our cars with a magnificent verbiage about wisdom and foreknowledge, and the treasure houses of the pharaohs, whom sometimes they compared to ants, and sometimes to elephants. They inspired us with the most ardent curiosity as to those mountains of hewn stone beneath which the Egyptian kings lie sepulchred. They compelled us to learn by heart the long catalogue of architects and masons who had labored at the building of them. They made us calculate the quality of provisions that would be required by the workmen employed, and how many threads went to every ell of silk with which Sultan Sorid had covered his pyramid. Together with all this rubbish, these most weariful old dotards bewildered our brains with a pitiless grammar of the language spoken of old by the priests in their subterranean labyrinths. The childish games in which we were allowed to indulge, during our playtime, had no charms for us unless we played them together. The princesses, our sisters, wearied us to death. Vainly did they embroider for my brother the most splendid vests. Kalila disdained their gifts, and would only consent to bind his lovely hair with the muslin that had floated over the breast of his beloved Zulkais. Sometimes they invited us to visit them in the 12 pavilions which my father, no longer hoping to have that number of sons, had abandoned to their use, erecting another, and of greater magnificence, for my brother and for myself. This latter building, crowned by 5 domes, and situated in a thick grove, was, every night, the scene of the most splendid revels in the harem. My father would come thither, escorted by his most beautiful slaves, each holding in her hand a candlestick with a white taper. How many times has the light of these tapers, appearing through the trees, caused our hearts to beat in sad anticipation. Everything that broke in upon our solitude was in the highest degree distasteful. To hide among the leafage, and listen to its murmur, seemed to us sweeter far than attending to the sound of the lute and the song of the musicians. But these soft, luxurious reveries of ours were highly offensive to my father. He would force us back into the cupoled saloons, and force us to take part in the common amusements. Every year the Emir treated us with greater sternness. He did not dare to separate us altogether for fear of the effect upon his son, but tried rather to win him from our languorous dalliance by throwing him more and more into the company of young men of his own age. The game of reeds, so famous among the Arabs, was introduced into the courts of the palace. Kalila gave himself up to the sport with immense energy. But this was only so as to bring the games to a speedier end, and then fly back to my side. Once reunited we would read together, read of the loves of Yusuf and Zelika, or some other poem that spoke of love, or else, taking advantage of our moments of liberty, we would roam through the labyrinth of corridors looking out upon the Nile, always with our arms intertwined, always with eyes looking into each other's eyes. It was almost impossible to track us in the mazy passages of the palace, and the anxiety we inspired did but add to our happiness. One evening when we were thus tenderly alone together, and running side by side in childish glee, my father appeared before us and shuddered. "Why," said he to Kalila, "why are you here and not in the great courtyard, shooting with the bow, or else with the horse trainers training the horses which are to bear you into battle? Must the sun, as it rises and sets, see you only bloom and fade like a weak narcissus flower? Vainly do the sages try to move you by the most eloquent discourses, and unveil before your eyes the learned mysteries of an older time. Vainly do they tell you of warlike and magnanimous deeds. You are now nearly 13, and never have you evinced the smallest ambition to distinguish yourself among your fellowmen. It is not in the lurking haunts of effeminacy that great characters are formed. It is not by reading love poems that men are made fit to govern nations. Princes must act. They must show themselves to the world. Awake. Cease to abuse my patience which has too long allowed you to waste your hours by the side of Zulkais. Let her, tender creature that she is, continue to play among her flowers, but do you cease to haunt her company from dawn till eve. I see well enough that it is she who is perverting you." Having spoken these words, which he emphasized by angry and threatening gestures, Abu Tahir Ahmed took my brother by the arm, and left me in a very abyss of bitterness. An icy numbness overcame me. Though the sun still shed its fullest rays upon the water, I felt as if it had disappeared below the horizon. Stretched at length upon the ground, I did nothing but kiss the sprays of orange flower that Khalila had gathered. My sight fell upon the drawings he had traced, and my tears fell in greater abundance. Alas, said one, all is over? Our blissful moments will return no more. Why accuse me of perverting Khalila? What harm can I do him? How can our happiness offend my father? If it was a crime to be happy, the sages would surely have given us warning. My nurse Shamila found me in this condition of languor and dejection. To dissipate my grief, she immediately led me to the grove where the young girls of the harem were playing at hide-and-seek amid the golden aviaries of which the place was full. I derived some little solace from the song of the birds, and the murmur of the rillets of clear water that trickled round the roots of the trees, but when the hour came at which Khalila was wont to appear, these sounds did but add to my sufferings. Shamila noticed the heavings of my breast. She drew me aside, placed her hand upon my heart, and observed me attentively. I blushed, I turned pale, and that very visibly. I see very well, said she, that it is your brother's absence that so upsets you. This is the fruit of the strange education to which you have been subjected. The holy reading of the Quran, the due observance of the Prophet's laws, confidence in the known mercies of Allah, these are as milk to cool the fever heat of human passion. You know not the soft delight of lifting up your soul to heaven, and submitting without a murmur to its decrees. The Emir, alas, would forestall the future, while, on the contrary, the future should be passively awaited. Dry your tears. Perchance Khalila is not unhappy though distant from your side. Ah! I cried, interrupting her with a sinister look, if I were not fully convinced that he is unhappy, I should myself be far more miserable. Shamila trembled at hearing me speak thus. She cried, would to heaven that they had listened to my advice, and the advice of Shaban, and instead of handing you over to the capricious teaching of the sages, had left you, like true believers, at peace in the arms of a blissful and quiet ignorance. The ardor of your feelings alarms me in the very highest degree. Nay, it excites my indignation. Be more calm, abandon your soul to the innocent pleasures that surround you, and do so without troubling yourself whether Khalila shares in those pleasures or not. His sex is made for toil and manly hardship. How should you be able to follow him in the chase, to handle a bow, and to dart reeds in the Arab game? He must look for companions manly and worthy of himself, and cease to fritter away his best days here at your side amid bowers and aviaries. This sermon, far from producing its desired effect, made me altogether beside myself. I trembled with rage, and rising to my feet like one bereft of reason, I rent my veil into 10,000 pieces, and tearing my breast, cried with a loud voice that my nurse had mishandled me. The game ceased. Everyone crowded about me, and though the princesses did not love me overmuch, because I was Khalila's favorite sister, yet my tears, and the blood that flowed from my self-inflicted wounds, excited their indignation against Shamila. Unfortunately for the poor woman, she had just awarded a severe punishment to 2 young slaves who had been guilty of stealing pomegranates, and these 2 little vipers, in order to be revenged, bore testimony against her, and confirmed all I said. They ran, and retailed their lies to my father, who, not having Shaban at his side, and being, moreover, in a good temper because my brother had just thrown a javelin into a crocodile's eye, ordered Shamila to be tied to a tree, and whipped without mercy. Her cries pierced my heart. She cried without ceasing, "O you, whom I have carried in my arms, whom I have fed from my breast, how can you cause me to suffer thus? Justify me. Declare the truth. It is only because I tried to save you from the black abyss, into which your wild and unruly desires cannot fail to precipitate you in the end, that you are thus causing this body of mine to be torn to shreds." I was about to ask that she should be released and spared further punishment, when some demon put into my mind the thought that it was she who, conjointly with Shaban, had inspired my father with the desire of making a hero of Kalila. Whereupon I armed myself against every feeling of humanity, and cried out that they should go on whipping her till she confessed her crime. Darkness at last put an end to this horrible scene. The victim was unloosed. Her friends, and she had many, endeavored to close her wounds. They asked me, on their knees, to give them a sovereign balm which I possessed, a balm which the sages had prepared. I refused. Shamila was placed before my eyes on a litter, and of set purpose, kept for a moment in front of the place where I stood. That breast, on which I had so often slept, streamed with blood. At this spectacle, at the memory of the tender care she had taken of my infancy, my heart at last was moved. I burst into tears. I kissed the hand she feebly extended to the monster she had nourished in her bosom. I ran to fetch the balm. I applied it myself, begging her, at the same time, to forgive me, and declaring openly that she was innocent, and I alone guilty. This confession caused a shudder to pass among all who surrounded us. They recoiled from me with horror. Shamila, though half dead, perceived this, and stifled her groans with the skirt of her garment so as not to add to my despair and the baleful consequences of what I had done. But her efforts were vain. All fled, casting upon me looks that were evil indeed. The litter was removed, and I found myself alone. The night was very dark. Plaintive sounds seemed to issue from the cypresses that cast their shadows over the place. Seized with terror, I lost myself amid the black foliage, a prey to the most harrowing remorse. Delirium laid its hand upon me. The earth seemed to yawn before my feet, and I to fall headlong into an abyss which had no bottom. My spirit was in this distraught condition when, through the thick underwood, I saw shine the torches of my father's attendants. I noticed that the cortege stopped suddenly. Someone issued from the crowd. A lively presentiment made my heart beat. The footsteps came nearer, and by the light of a faint and doleful glimmer, such as prevails in the place where we now are, I saw Kalila appear before me. "Dear Zulkais," cried he, intermingling words and kisses, "I have passed an age without seeing you, but I have spent it in carrying out my father's wishes. I have fought with one of the most formidable monsters of the river. But what would I not do when, for recompense, I am offered the bliss of spending a whole evening with you alone? Come. Let us enjoy the time to the full. Let us bury ourselves among these trees. Let us, from our retreat, listen, disdainful, to the tumultuous sound of music and dances. I will cause sherbet and cakes to be served on the moss that borders the little porphyry fountain. There I shall enjoy your sweet looks and charming converse till the first dawn of the new day. Then, alas, I must plunge once more into the world's vortex, dart accursed reeds, and undergo the interrogatories of sages." Kalila said all this with such volubility that I was unable to put in a word. He drew me after him, scarce resisting. We made our way through the leafage to the fountain. The memory of what Shamila had said concerning my excessive tenderness for my brother had, in my own despite, produced a strong impression upon me. I was about to withdraw my hand from his, when, by the light of the little lamps that had been lit on the margin of the fountain, I saw his charming face reflected in the waters. I saw his large eyes dewy with love. I felt his looks pierce to the very bottom of my heart. All my projects of reform, all my agony of remorse, made way for a ferment of very different feelings. I dropped on the ground by Kalila's side, and leaning his head upon my breast, gave a free course to my tears. Kalila, when he saw me thus crying passionately, eagerly asked me why I wept. I told him all that had passed between myself and Shamila, without omitting a single particular. His heart was at first much moved by the picture I drew of her sufferings, but a moment after, he cried, "Let the officious slave perish! Must the heart's soft yearnings ever meet with opposition? How should we not love one another, Zulkais? Nature caused us to be born together. Has not nature, too, implanted in us the same tastes, and a kindred ardor? Have not my father and his sages made us partakers in the same magic baths? Who could blame a sympathy all has conspired to create? No, Zulkais, Shaban, and our superstitious nurse may say what they please. There is no crime in our loving one another. The crime would rather be if we allowed ourselves, like cowards, to be separated. Let us swear, not by the Prophet, of whom we have little knowledge, but by the elements that sustain man's existence, let us swear that, rather than consent to live the one without the other, we will take into our veins the soft distillation of the flowers of the stream, which the sages have so often vaunted in our hearing. That essence will lull us painlessly to sleep in each other's arms, and so bear our souls imperceptibly into the peace of another existence. These words quieted me. I resumed my ordinary gaiety, and we played and sported together. I shall be very valiant tomorrow, Kalila would say, so as to purchase such moments as these, for it is only by the promise of such a prize that my father can induce me to submit to his fantastic injunctions. Ha ha! Cried Abu Tabr Ahmed, issuing from behind some bushes, where he had been listening. Is that your resolve? We will see if you keep to it. You are already fully paid this evening for the little you have done during the day. Hence. And as to you, Zulkais, go and weep over the terrible outrage you have committed against Shamila. In the greatest consternation we threw ourselves at his feet, but turning his back upon us, he ordered the eunuchs to conduct us to our separate apartments. It was no scruple with regard to the kind and quality of our love that exercised the emir. His sole end was to see his son become a great warrior and a potent prince, and with regard to the character of the means by which that end was to be obtained, he cared not one tittle. As for me, he regarded me only as an instrument that might have its uses, nor would he have felt any scruples concerning the danger of inflaming our passion by the alternation of obstacles and concessions. On the other hand, he foresaw that indolence and pleasure, too constantly indulged in, must necessarily interfere with his designs. He deemed it necessary, therefore, to adopt with us a harsher and more decided line of conduct than he had hitherto done, and in an unhappy moment he carried that resolution into effect. Alas! Without his precautions, his projects, his accursed foresight, we should have remained in innocence, and never been brought to the horror of this place of torment. The emir, having retired to his apartments, caused Shaban to be summoned, and imparted to him his fixed resolve to separate us during a certain time. The prudent eunuch prostrated himself immediately, with his face to the ground, and then, rising to his feet, said, "Let my lord forgive his slave if he ventures to be of a different opinion. Do not loose upon this nascent flame the winds of opposition and absence, lest the final conflagration should be such as you are unable to master. You know the prince's impetuous disposition. His sister has today given proofs, only too signal, of hers. Suffer them to remain together without contradiction, leave them to their childish propensities. They will soon grow tired of one another, and Kalila, disgusted with the monotony of the harem, will beg you on his knees to remove him from its precincts." "Have you done talking your nonsense?" interrupted the emir impatiently. "Ah, how little do you know the genius of Kalila! I have carefully studied him. I have seen that the operations of my sages have not been void of their effect. He is incapable of pursuing any object with indifference. If I leave him with Zulkais, he will be utterly drowned in effeminacy. If I remove her from him, and make their reunion the price of the great things I require at his hands, there is nothing of which he will not prove himself capable. Let the doctors of our law dote as they please. What can their idle drivel matter so long as he becomes what I desire him to be? Know besides, O eunuch, that when he has once tasted the delights of ambition, the idea of Zulkais will evaporate in his mind as a light morning mist absorbed into the rays of the noonday sun, the sun of glory. Therefore enter tomorrow morning into the chamber of Zulkais, forestall her awakening, wrap her up in these robes, and convey her, with her slaves and all that may be necessary to make her life pleasant, to the borders of the Nile, where a boat will be ready to receive you. Follow the course of the stream for 29 days. On the 30th you will disembark at the Isle of Ostriches. Lodge the princess in the palace which I have had built for the use of the sages who roam those deserts. Deserts replete with ruins and with wisdom. One of these sages you will find there, called the palm tree climber, because he pursues his course of contemplation upon the tops of the palm trees. This ancient man knows an infinite number of stories, and it will be his care to divert sulkies, for I know very well that, next to Kalila, stories are the chief object of her delight. Shaban knew his master too well to venture upon any further opposition. He went, therefore, to give the necessary orders, but sighed heavily as he went. He had not the slightest desire to undertake a journey to the Isle of Ostriches, and had formed a very unfavorable opinion of the palm tree climber. He was himself a faithful Mussulman, and held the sages and all their works in abomination. Everything was made ready all too soon. The agitation of the previous day had greatly fatigued me, so that I slept very heavily. I was taken from my bed so quietly, and carried with such skill, that I never woke till I was at a distance of 4 leagues from Cairo. Then the noise of the water gurgling round the boat began to alarm me. It filled my ears strangely, and I half fancied I had drunk of the beverage spoken of by Kalila, and been borne beyond the confines of our planet. I lay thus, bewildered with strange imaginings, and did not dare to open my eyes, but stretched out my arms to feel for Kalila. I thought he was by my side. Judge of the feelings of hateful surprise to which I was doomed, when, instead of touching his delicate limbs, I seized hold of the horny hand of the eunuch who was steering the boat, and was even older, and more grotesquely ugly, than Shaban himself. I sat up and uttered piercing cries. I opened my eyes, and saw before me a waste stretch of sky, and of water bounded by bluish banks. The sun was shining in its fullness. The azure heavens caused all nature to rejoice. 1,000 river birds played around amid the water lilies, which the boat shot through at every moment, their large yellow flowers shining like gold, and exhaling a sweet perfume. But all these objects of delight were lost upon me, and instead of rejoicing my heart, filled me with a somber melancholy. Looking about me, I saw my slaves in a state of desolation, and Shaban who, with an air at once of discontent and authority, was making them keep silence. The name of Kalila came at every moment to the tip of my tongue. At last I spoke it aloud, with tears in my eyes, and asked where he was, and what they intended to do with me. Shaban, instead of replying, ordered his eunuchs to redouble their exertions, and to strike up an Egyptian song, and sing in time to the cadence of their oars. Their accursed chorus rang out so potently that it brought an even worse bewilderment in my brain. We shot through the water like an arrow. It was in vain that I begged the rowers to stop, or at least to tell me where I was going. The barbarous wretches were deaf to my entreaties. The more insistent I was, the louder did they roar out their detestable songs so as to drown my cries. Shaban, with his cracked voice, made more noise than the rest. Nothing can express the torments I endured, and the horror I felt at finding myself so far from Kalila, and on the waters of the fearful Nile. My terrors increased with nightfall. I saw, with an inexpressible anguish, the sun go losing itself in the waters, its light, in 1,000 rays, trembling upon their surface. I brought to mind the quiet moments which, at that same hour, I had passed with Kalila, and hiding my head in my veil, I gave myself up to despair. Soon a soft rustling became audible. Our boat was shearing its way through banks of reeds. A great silence succeeded to the song of the rowers, for Shaban had landed. He came back in a few moments, and carried me to a tent, erected a few paces from the river's bank. I found there lights, mattresses stretched on the ground, a table covered with various kinds of food, and an immense copy of the Quran unfolded. I hated the holy book. The sages, our instructors, had often turned it into ridicule, and I had never read it with Kalila. So I threw it contemptuously to the ground. Shaban took upon himself to scold me, but I flew at him, and endeavored to reduce him to silence. In this I proved successful, and the same treatment retained its efficacy during the whole course of the long expedition. Our subsequent experiences were similar to those of the first day. Endlessly did we pass banks of water lilies, and flocks of birds, and an infinite number of small boats that came and went with merchandise. At last we began to leave behind us the plain country. Like all who are unhappy and thus led to look forward, I kept my eyes continually fixed on the horizon ahead of us, and one evening I saw, rising there, great masses of much greater height, and of a form infinitely more varied than the pyramids. These masses proved to be mountains. Their aspect inspired me with fear. The terrible thought occurred to me that my father was sending me to the woeful land of the Negro King, so that I might be offered up as a sacrifice to the idols, who, as the sages pretended, were greedy of princesses. Shaban perceived my increasing distress, and at last took pity upon me. He revealed our ultimate destination, adding that though my father wished to separate me from Kalila, it was not forever, and that, in the meanwhile, I should make the acquaintance of a marvelous personage, called the Palm Tree Climber, who was the best storyteller in the universe. This information quieted me to some extent. The hope, however distant, of seeing Kalila again, poured balm into my soul, and I was not sorry to hear that I should have stories to my liking. Moreover, the idea of a realm of solitude, such as the Ostrich Isle, flattered my romantic spirit. If I must be separated from him whom I cherished more than life itself, I preferred to undergo my fate rather in some savage spot than amid the glitter and chatter of a harem. Far from all such impertinent frivolities, I purposed to abandon my whole soul to the sweet memories of the past, and give a free course to the languorous reveries in which I could see again the loved image of my Kalila. Fully occupied with these projects, it was with heedless eyes that I saw our boat approaching nearer and nearer to the land of mountains. The rocks encroached more and more upon the border of the stream, and seemed soon about to deprive us of all sight of the sky. I saw trees of immeasurable height whose intertwisted roots hung down in the water. I heard the noise of cataracts, and saw the boiling eddies flash and foam and fill the air with a mist thin as silver gauze. Through this veil I perceived, at last, a green island of no great size, on which the ostriches were gravely promenading. Still further forward I discerned a domed edifice standing against a hill all covered with nests. This palace was utterly strange of aspect, and had, in truth, been built by a noted Kabbalist. The walls were of yellow marble, and shone like polished metal, and every object reflected in them assumed gigantic proportions. I trembled when I saw what fantastic figures the ostriches presented as seen in that strange mirror. Their necks seemed to go losing themselves in the clouds, and their eyes shone like enormous balls of iron heated red in a furnace. My terrors were observed by Shaban, who made me understand the magnifying qualities of the palace walls, and assured me that even if the birds were really as monstrous as they appeared, I might trust, in all security, to their good manners, since the palm tree climber had been laboring for over 100 years to reduce their disposition to an exemplary mildness. Scarcely had he furnished me with this information, when I landed at a spot where the grass was green and fresh. 1,000 unknown flowers, 1,000 shells of fantastic shape, 1,000 oddly fashioned snails, adorned the shore. The ardor of the sun was tempered by the perpetual dew distilled from the falling waters, whose monotonous sound inclined to slumber. Feeling drowsy, I ordered a penthouse to be affixed to one of the palm trees of which the place was full, for the palm tree climber, who always bore at his girdle the keys of the palace, was at that hour pursuing his meditations at the other end of the island. While a soft drowsiness took possession of my senses, Shaban ran to present my father's letters to the man of wisdom. In order to do this, he was compelled to attach the missives to the end of a long pole, as the climber was at the top of a palm tree 50 cubits high, and refused to come down without knowing why he was summoned. So soon as he had perused the leaves of the roll, he carried them respectfully to his forehead, and slipped down like a meteor, and indeed he had somewhat the appearance of a meteor, for his eyes were aflame, and his nose was a beautiful blood red. Shaban, amazed by the rapidity of the old man's descent, uninjured from the tree, was somewhat outraged when asked to take him on his back, but the climber declared that he never so far condescended as to walk. The eunuch, who loved neither sages nor their caprices, and regarded both as the plagues of the emir's family, hesitated for a moment, but bearing in mind the positive order he had received, he conquered his aversion, and took the palm tree climber on his shoulders, saying, "Alas, the good hermit Abu Gabd al-Gayman would not have behaved after this manner, and would, moreover, have been much more worthy of my assistance." The climber heard these words in high dudgeon, for he had aforetime had pious squabbles with the hermit of the sandy desert, so he administered a mighty kick on to the small of Shaban's back, and thrust a fiery nose into the middle of his countenance. Shaban on this stumbled, but pursued his way without uttering a syllable. I was still asleep. Shaban came up to my couch, and throwing his burden at my feet said, and his voice had a certain ring in it that woke me without difficulty, "Here is the climber. Much good may he do you." At the sight of such an object, I was quite unable, notwithstanding all my sorrows, to help bursting out into a fit of uncontrollable laughter. The old man did not change countenance, notwithstanding. He jingled his keys with an air of importance, and said to Shaban, in grave tones, "Take me again upon your back, let us go to the palace, and I will open its doors, which have never, hitherto, admitted any member of the female sex save my great Eglayer, the queen of the ostriches." I followed. It was late. The great birds were coming down from the hills, and surrounded us in flocks, pecking at the grass and at the trees. The noise they made with their beaks was such that I seemed to be listening to the feet of an army on the march. At last I found myself before the shining walls of the palace. Though I knew the trick of them, my own distorted figure terrified me, as did also the figure of the climber on the shoulders of Shaban. We entered into a vaulted apartment, lined with black marble starred with golden stars, which inspired a certain feeling of awe, a feeling to which, however, the old man's grotesque and amusing grimaces afforded some relief. The air was stifling and nearly made me sick. The climber, perceiving this, caused a great fire to be lit, and threw into it a small aromatic ball which he drew from his bosom. Immediately a vapor, rather pleasant to the smell, but very penetrating, diffused itself throughout the room. The eunuch fled, sneezing. As for me, I drew near the fire, and sadly stirring the ashes, began to form in them the cipher of Kalila. The climber did not interfere. He praised the education I had received, and approved greatly of our immersions, just after birth, by the sages, adding maliciously that nothing so sharpened the wits as a passion somewhat out of the common. "I see clearly," he continued, "that you are absorbed in reflections of an interesting nature, and I am well pleased that it should be so. I myself had 5 sisters. We made very light of Muhammad's teachings, and loved each other with some fervor. I still, after the lapse of 100 years, bear this in my memory with pleasure, for we scarcely ever forget early impressions. Thus my constancy has greatly commended me to the jinns whose favorite I am. If you are able, like myself, to persevere in your present sentiments, they will probably do something for you. In the meanwhile, place your confidence in me. I shall not prove surly or unsympathetic as a guardian and keeper. Don't get it into your head that I am dependent on the caprice of your father, who has a limited outlook, and prefers ambition to pleasure. I am happier amid my palms, and my ostriches, and in the enjoyments of the delights of meditation, than he in his divan, and in all his grandeur. I don't mean to say that you yourself cannot add to the pleasures of my life. The more gracious you are to me, the more shall I show civility to you, and make you the partaker in things of beauty. If you seem to be happy in this place of solitude, you will acquire a great reputation for wisdom, and I know, by my own experience, that under the cloak of a great reputation it is possible to hide whole treasures of folly. Your father in his letters has told me all your story. While people think that you are giving heed to my instructions, you can talk to me about your Kalila as much as you like, and without offending me in any way. On the contrary, nothing affords me greater pleasure than to observe the movements of a heart abandoning itself to its youthful inclinations, and I shall be glad to see the bright colors of a first love mantling on young cheeks. While listening to this strange discourse, I kept my eyes on the ground, but the bird of hope fluttered in my bosom. At last I looked at the sage, and his great red nose, that shone like a luminous point in that room of black marble, seemed to me less disagreeable. The smile accompanying my glance was of such significance that the climber easily perceived I had swallowed his bait. This pleased him so mightily that he forgot his learned indolence, and ran to prepare a repast of which I stood greatly in need. Scarcely had he departed, when Shaban came in, holding in his hand a letter sealed with my father's seal, which he had just opened. "Here," said he, "are the instructions I was only to read when I reached this place, and I have read them only too clearly. Alas, how wretched it is to be the slave of a prince whose head has been turned by much learning. Unhappy princess! I am compelled, much against my will, to abandon you here. I must re-embark with all who have followed me hither, and only leave in your service the lame Muzaka, who is deaf and dumb. The wretched climber will be your only helper. Heaven alone knows what you will gain from his companionship. The Emir regards him as a prodigy of learning and wisdom, but as to this he must suffer a faithful Mussulman to have his doubts." As he spoke these words, Shaban touched the letter 3 times with his forehead, and then, leaping backwards, disappeared from my sight. The hideous manner in which the poor eunuch wept on leaving me amused me much. I was far indeed from making any attempt to keep him back. His presence was odious to me, for he always avoided all conversation about the only subject that filled my heart. On the other hand, I was enchanted at the choice of Muzaka as my attendant. With a deaf and dumb slave, I should enjoy full liberty in imparting my confidences to the obliging old man, and in following his advice, if so be that he gave me advice of which I approved. All my thoughts were thus assuming a somewhat rosy hue, when the climber returned, smothered up in carpets and cushions of silk, which he stretched out on the ground, and he then proceeded, with a pleasant and contented air, to light torches, and to burn pastilles in braziers of gold. He had taken these sumptuous articles from the palace treasury, which, as he assured me, was well worthy of exciting my curiosity. I told him I was quite ready to take his word for it at that particular time, the smell of the excellent viands which had preceded him having very agreeably whetted my appetite. These viands consisted chiefly of slices of deer spiced with fragrant herbs, of eggs prepared after divers recipes, and of cakes more dainty and delicate than the petals of a white rose. There was besides a ruddy liquor, made of date juice, and served in strange translucent shells, and sparkling like the eyes of the climber himself. We lay down to our meal together in very friendly fashion. My amazing keeper greatly praised the quality of his wine, and made very good use of it, to the intense surprise of Muzaka, who, huddled up in a corner, indulged in undescribable gestures which the marble reflected on all sides. The fire burnt gaily, throwing out sparks, which, as they darkened, exhaled an exquisite perfume. The torches gave a brilliant light, the braziers shone brightly, and the soft warmth that reigned in the apartment inclined to a voluptuous indolence. The situation in which I found myself was so singular, the kind of prison in which I was confined was so different from anything I could have imagined, and the ways of my keeper were so grotesque, that from time to time I rubbed my eyes to make sure that the whole thing was not a dream. I should even have derived amusement from my surroundings, if the thought that I was so far from Kalila had left me for a single moment. The climber, to distract my thoughts, began the marvelous story of the giant Jebri and the artful Karod, but I interrupted him, and asked him to listen to the recital of my own real sorrows, promising that, afterwards, I should give ear to his tales. Alas! I never kept that promise. Vainly, at repeated intervals, did he try to excite my curiosity. I had none save with regard to Kalila, and did not cease to repeat, "Where is he? What is he doing? When shall I see him again?" The old man, seeing me so headstrong in my passion, and so well resolved to brave all remorse, became convinced that I was a fit object for his nefarious purposes, for, as my hearers will doubtless have already understood, he was a servant of the monarch who reigns in this place of torment. In the perversity of his soul, and that fatal blindness which makes men desire to find an entrance here, he had vowed to induce 20 wretches to serve Eblis, and he exactly wanted my brother and myself to complete that number. Far indeed was he, therefore, from really trying to stifle the yearnings of my heart, and though, in order to fan the flame that consumed me, he seemed from time to time to be desirous of telling me stories, yet, in reality, his head was filled with quite other thoughts. I spent a great part of the night in making my criminal avowals. Towards morning I fell asleep. The climber did the same, at a few paces' distance, having first, without ceremony, applied to my forehead a kiss that burned me like a red-hot iron. My dreams were of the saddest. They left but a confused impression on my mind, but, so far as I can recollect, they conveyed the warnings of heaven, which still desired to open before me a door of escape and of safety. So soon as the sun had risen, the climber led me into his woods, introduced me to his ostriches, and gave me an exhibition of his supernatural agility. Not only did he climb to the tremulous tops of the tallest and most slender palms, bending them beneath his feet like cars of corn, but he would dart like an arrow from one tree to another. After the display of several of these gymnastic feats, he settled on a branch, told me he was about to indulge in his daily meditations, and advised me to go with Mazaka and bathe by the border of the stream, on the other side of the hill. The heat was excessive. I found the clear waters cool and delicious. Bathing pools, lined with precious marbles, had been hollowed out in the middle of a little level mead over which high rocks cast their shadow. Pale narcissi and gladioli grew on the margin, and leaning towards the water, waved over my head. I loved these languid flowers, they seemed an emblem of my fortunes, and for several hours I allowed their perfumes to intoxicate my soul. On returning to the palace, I found that the climber had made great preparations for my entertainment. The evening passed like the evening before, and from day to day, pretty nearly after the same manner, I spent 4 months. Nor can I say that the time passed unhappily. The romantic solitude, the old man's patient attention, and the complacency with which he listened to love's foolish repetitions, all seemed to unite in soothing my pain. I should perhaps have spent whole years in merely nursing those sweet illusions that are so rarely realized, have seen the ardor of my passion dwindle and die, have become no more than the tender sister and friend of Kalila, if my father had not, in pursuit of his wild schemes, delivered me over to the impious scoundrel who sat daily watching at my side to make me his prey. Ah, Shaban. Ah, Shamila. You, my real friends, why was I torn from your arms? Why did you not, from the very first, perceive the germs of a too passionate tenderness existing in our hearts, germs which ought then and there to have been extirpated, since the day would come when not fire and steel would be of any avail? One morning when I was steeped in sad thoughts, and expressing in even more violent language than usual my despair at being separated from Kalila, the old man fixed upon me his piercing eyes, and addressed me in these words: Princess, you, who have been taught by the most enlightened of sages, cannot doubtless be ignorant of the fact that there are intelligences, superior to the race of man, who take part in human affairs, and are able to extricate us from the greatest difficulties. I, who am telling you this, have had experience, more than once, of their power, for I had a right to their assistance, having been placed, as you yourself have been, under their protection from birth. I quite see that you cannot live without your Kalila. It is time, therefore, that you should apply for aid to such helpful spirits. But will you have the strength of mind, the courage to endure the approach of beings so different from mankind? I know that their coming produces certain inevitable effects, as internal tremors, the revulsion of the blood from its ordinary course. But I know also that these terrors, these revulsions, painful as they undoubtedly are, must appear as nothing compared with the mortal pain of separation from an object loved greatly and exclusively. If you resolve to invoke the Jinn of the Great Pyramid, who, as I know, presided at your birth, if you are willing to abandon yourself to his care, I can, this very evening, give you speech of your brother, who is nearer than you imagine. The being in question, so renowned among the sages, is called Omotakos. He is, at present, in charge of the treasure which the ancient Kabbalist kings have placed in this desert. By means of the other spirits under his command, he is in close touch with his sister, whom, by the by, he loved in his time just as you now love Kalila. He will, therefore, enter into your sorrows just as much as I do myself, and will, I make no doubt, do all he can to further your desires. At these last words, my heart beat with unspeakable violence. The possibility of seeing Kalila once again excited a transport in my breast. I rose hastily, and ran about the room like a mad creature. Then, coming back to the old man's side, I embraced him, called him my father, and throwing myself at his knees, I implored him, with clasped hands, not to defer my happiness, but to conduct me, at whatever hazard, to the sanctuary of Omotakos. The crafty old scoundrel was well pleased, and saw with a malicious eye into what a state of delirium he had thrown me. His only thought was how to fan the flame thus kindled. For this purpose, he resumed a cold and reserved aspect, and said, in tones of great solemnity, "Be it known to you, Zulkais, that I have my doubts, and cannot help hesitating, in a matter of such importance, great as is my desire to serve you. You evidently do not know how dangerous is the step you propose to take, or, at least, you do not fully appreciate its extreme rashness. I cannot tell how far you will be able to endure the fearful solitude of the immeasurable vaults you must traverse, and the strange magnificence of the place to which I must conduct you. Neither can I tell in what shape the jinn will appear. I have often seen him in a form so fearful that my senses have long remained numbed. At other times he has shown himself under an aspect so grotesque that I have scarcely been able to refrain from choking laughter, for nothing can be more capricious than beings of that nature. Omotakos, mayhap, will spare your weakness, but it is right to warn you that the adventure on which you are bound is perilous, that the moment of the jinn's apparition is uncertain, that while you are waiting in expectation you must show neither fear nor horror, nor impatience, and that, at the sight of him, you must be very sure not to laugh, and not to cry. Observe, moreover, that you must wait in silence, and the stillness of death, and with your hands crossed over your breast, until he speaks to you, for a gesture, a smile, a groan, would involve not only your destruction, but also that of Kalila, and my own. All that you tell me, I replied, carries terror into my bosom, but, impelled by such a fatal love as mine, what would one not venture? I congratulate you on your sublime perseverance, rejoined the climber, with a smile of which I did not then appreciate the full significance and wickedness. Prepare yourself. As soon as darkness covers the earth, I will go and suspend Muzaka from the top of one of my highest palm trees, so that she may not be in our way. I will then lead you to the door of the gallery that leads to the retreat of Omotakos. There I shall leave you, and myself, according to my custom, go and meditate at the top of one of the trees, and make vows for the success of your enterprise. I spent the interval in anxiety and trepidation. I wandered aimlessly amid the valleys and hillocks on the island. I gazed fixedly into the depths of the waters. I watched the rays of the sun declining over their surface, and looked forward, half in fear and half in hope, to the moment when the light should abandon our hemisphere. The holy calm of a serene night at last overspread the world. I saw the climber detach himself from a flock of ostriches that were gravely marching to drink at the river. He came to me with measured steps. Putting his finger to his lips, he said, "Follow me in silence." I obeyed. He opened a door, and made me enter, with him, into a narrow passage, not more than 4 feet high, so that I was compelled to walk half doubled up. The air I breathed was damp and stifling. At every step I caught my feet in viscous plants that issued from certain cracks and crevices in the gallery. Through these cracks the feeble light of the moon's rays found an entrance, shedding light, every here and there, upon little wells that had been dug to right and left of our path. Through the black waters in these wells I seemed to see reptiles with human faces. I turned away my eyes in horror. I burned with desire to ask the climber what all this might mean, but the gloom and solemnity of his looks made me keep silence. He appeared to progress painfully, and to be brushing aside with his hands something to me invisible. Soon I was no longer able to see him at all. We were going, as it seemed, round and round in complete darkness, and so as not to lose him altogether in that frightful labyrinth, I was compelled to lay hold upon his robe. At last we reached a place where I began to breathe a freer and fresher air. A solitary taper of enormous size, fixed upright in a block of marble, lighted up a vast hall, and discovered to my eyes 5 staircases, whose banisters, made of different metals, faded upwards into the darkness. There we stopped, and the old man broke the silence, saying, "Choose between these staircases. One only leads to the treasury of Omotakos. From the others, which go losing themselves to cavernous depths, you would never return. Where they lead you would find nothing but hunger, and the bones of those whom famine has aforetime destroyed." Having said these words, he disappeared, and I heard a door closing behind him. Judge of my terror, you who have heard the ebony portals, which confine us forever in this place of torment, grind upon their ebony hinges. Indeed, I dare to say that my position was, if possible, even more terrible than yours, for I was alone. I fell to the earth at the base of the block of marble. A sleep, such as that which ends our mortal existence, overcame my senses. Suddenly a voice, clear, sweet, insinuating like the voice of Kalila, flattered my ears. I seemed, as in a dream, to see him on the staircase, the banisters of which were of brass. A majestic warrior, whose pale front bore a diadem, held him by the hand. "Sulkais," said Kalila, with an afflicted air, "Allah forbids our union. But Eblis, whom you see here, extends to us his protection. Implore his aid, and follow the path to which he points you." I awoke in a transport of courage and resolution, seized the taper, and began, without hesitation, to ascend the stairway with the brazen banisters. The steps seemed to multiply beneath my feet. But my resolution never faltered, and, at last, I reached a chamber, square, and immensely spacious, and paved with a marble that was of flesh color, and marked as with the veins and arteries of the human body. The walls of this place of terror were hidden by huge piles of carpets of 1,000 kinds, and 1,000 hues, and these moved slowly to and fro, as if painfully stirred by human creatures stifling beneath their weight. All around were ranged black chests, whose steel padlocks seemed encrusted with blood. Muffled hissings appeared to issue from under the lids of some of these chests, from others, groans and cries as of indistinct voices, and metallic clinkings. I thought that the voices were those of dives, or afrits, rather than men. I shuddered, and fled on, all the more precipitately because some of them had seemed to call me by name. The chamber was endless, and I saw that I had been mistaken as to its form. It enlarged itself before me, like the perspectives of a hall of ill dreams. Insensibly, and as if by the operation of some enchantment, it assumed a more frightful aspect. The marble pavement was now of that livid color seen in the flesh of bodies after death. Its veinings were dark, as if blood had coagulated within them, and were interspersed with mottlings such as would be made on human skin by the contusions of iron maces. Columns, higher than the monumental pillars of the old kings of Egypt, rose round me into gloom that the great taper was unable to pierce. A blue mist, such as might ascend from nether gulfs, wavered like a curtain before the removed walls, and the light flickered woefully in my arms, as it met the dank sighing exhaled by the subterranean reaches. I had need of all my resolution, and was forced to summon up the loved image of Kalila, with all possible clearness, before I could proceed any further. The vastness of the room, its dismal character and furnishings, terrified me more and more. A weakness seized upon my limbs and senses, the taper became an almost insupportable burden, and I could scarce uplift it to inspect the curious treasures piled about me. Notwithstanding this, I perceived that there were open caskets, overrunning with diverse jewels, with gold work wrought in the fashion of antiquity, and still untarnished, so that I felt sure, at first, that I had reached the treasury of Omotakos, the jinn to whom the Kabbalist kings had entrusted their wealth. But soon doubt came upon me, as I began to note the hideous confusion that prevailed everywhere, the human finger bones, and other charnel relics, that were heaped without discrimination amid the precious stones, or stored in separate vessels of graven silver, as if they too had been of rare worth. I saw, also, that some of the larger caskets were really sarcophagi, such as were used by the Egyptians. They had been brimmed with skulls, and the severed members of mummies, and gold coins. Serpents, milk-white, and wholly scaleless, crept to and fro, bringing in their mouths bright jewels, or fragments of bone, which they deposited in certain receptacles that were not yet filled to the rim. A faintness, such as the dying must undergo, would have overcome me at the sight of these horrors, and the musty odors which they emitted, but I was revived by an extraordinary apparition, which, through the speed and brilliance of its descent from one of the topless pillars, I took for a moment to be the palm tree climber. The apparition reached the floor in a flash. It rose up, and I saw my mistake. It was almost more than I could do to refrain from bursting into wild laughter, for the uncommon personage before me resembled, as much as anything else, a mangy baboon whose hair had fallen out in broad patches. His head and face, indeed, were altogether hairless, like those of the ancient priests, but the brows had been painted with kohl to relieve their blank appearance, and the same cosmetic had been applied in large mooches about the jowls. He carried at his side, from a girdle of human gut, a capacious and somewhat tattered pouch, in the form of a stomach sack, from whose rifts unmentionable objects protruded. More amazing than all this, however, was the long tail, seeming to be on fire perpetually, which the remarkable being flourished in my face like a torch. Recalling the injunctions of the climber, I succeeded in smothering my mirth, and maintained a strict silence. It was well, no doubt, that I did so. Omotakos, for it was indeed the jinn himself, addressed me in a hollow and lugubrious voice that accorded somewhat strangely with his aspect, saying, "Princess, you need carry no longer the immense taper whose weight has grown so burdensome to you. My tail, which burns with inexhaustible fire, will now serve as a flambeau for us both." He indicated a half-empty sarcophagus, in which, with expressive signs, he told me to deposit the taper, leaving it upright so that the grease would not gutter upon the rare contents of that reliquary. Then he said to me, "As a fitting reward for your perseverance in daring the shadows of the subterranean labyrinth, I shall show you the many treasures which have been amassed in this chamber, during the eras of my custodianship. To the wealth of the Kabbalist rulers, in itself quite prodigious, I have since added much that I prize peculiarly. Eblis, it is true, in his deep-lying halls, has been able to gather together a far more inclusive assortment of terrestrial riches, but I venture to assert that my collection, in some ways, is a little choicer than his. For example, in this casket you behold, among other remnants of former delight and beauty, a thigh bone that once belonged to Bacchus." He waved his tail, which flared brightly, above the relic in question, and then, with a ludicrous and proprietary air, passed on to others. At one time, during our tour, he paused before a small box of green bronze, filled with a dark brown powder, and lifting a pinch of the powder to his nostrils, gave vent to prolonged and violent sternuations. When these had ceased, he remarked with much satisfaction, "There is, to my knowledge, no sneezing powder more efficacious than the one I have just employed, which was obtained through the atomizing of the mummies of antique embalmers." My astonishment and disgust were mingled with a strange propensity to laughter, which I conquered again and yet again, with much difficulty. Omotakos, in a most extensive circuit of inspection about the chamber, illumined for me with the unfailing light of his appendage an infinite variety of objects that testified to mortal corruption. All the while, he discoursed upon their quondam ownership, and their history, in a fashion that was no less proud than funereal. He showed me, moreover, certain musical instruments, which he himself had designed during hours of leisure. Among them, I remember that there were lutes fashioned from the ribs and arm bones of women, and stringed with male sinews, and also there were tabors of human skin, that bad a deep sonority. On more than one of these instruments he played a while for my diversion, and though I thought the airs he extorted from them were more than atrocious, I felt that it would be politic to commend, rather than criticize, his playing. In the meanwhile, I burned with desire to question him regarding the whereabouts of Kalila, and the means through which we might again be united, but mindful of all that the climber had told me, I restrained my eagerness. At last, Omotakos, who had led me on for a great distance between the columns and the sarcophagi, and had laid aside his unusual instruments of music, turned on me, and said, "Think not, O princess, that all my treasures are things which have come down from antiquity. In the recesses of this unfathomable chamber, objects of more recent date are also conserved. One of them, at least, will interest you. Be patient, and follow the illumination of my tale." With this adjuration, he conducted me to an open sarcophagus, gilded, and carved from end to end with hieroglyphics, that stood a little apart from the others. In it, with unutterable horror and anguish, I discerned the form of Kalila, lying as if dead, with a mortal pallor on his cheeks, and lips, and eyelids. I noted that the bosom of his raiment was torn and bloody. I hurled myself upon him, and sought to revive him with kisses, but in vain. Omotakos, at this point, chose and interrupt my efforts by inserting the agile tip of his combustive tail between myself and the face of Kalila. He observed, in a severe tone, "There is but one way in which the prince, your beloved brother, can be revived. The method, fortunately, lies at my immediate disposal. First, however, I will explain to you the presence of Kalila in this place. The Emir Abu Tabr Ahmed, in attempting to continue the heroic education he designed for your brother, sent him forth with a small retinue the other day, to hunt the ferocious lions of the Nubian desert. These lions, appearing in unwonted number, and with more than their usual rapacity, disposed of the followers of Kalila, and would have served the prince in like manner, if some of my subordinate jinns, who were watching over the expedition, had not intervened. Unluckily, they were too late to keep Kalila from being wounded almost to death by the talons of the beasts. They brought him here, only a few hours since, and I have permitted him to occupy the sarcophagus of an elder pharaoh, though my wisdom has told me that the tenancy will be of brief duration, and that Kalila cannot be numbered among my permanent acquisitions. If you, Zulkais, will consent to a very simple matter, I will give into your hand, without delay, a supremely sovereign restorative." "Anything. Anything," I cried wildly. "I consent to whatever you ask, if only Kalila be brought back to life." "You need promise only one thing," quoth Omotakos. "Pledge your fealty to Eblis, the lord of the fiery globe, and the shadowy caverns." "It is pledged," I replied hastily. "Give me the restorative." Omotakos, with his apish fingers, began to fumble in the tattered pouch that hung at his girdle. I caught sight of certain highly nauseating oddments, from among which, presently, he produced a pale yellow fruit, having somewhat the form and size of a peach, and laid it in the palm of my hand. This fruit, he informed me, was grown in a garden which, without ever having beheld the sun, is more fertile than the gardens of Iram. If you squeeze it very gently above the lips of Kalila, a single drop of its juice, falling down upon them, will suffice to resuscitate him in all the bloom that you have loved so dearly. The fruit, after that, is yours to retain, but I trust that you will not be so careless as to devour it at any future time. If you were to do this, the results would be very surprising, since the action of the juice on those who languish at the gates of death, and those who exult in the fullness of life, is an altogether different thing." Scarcely heeding any of his words, I hastened to squeeze the yellow fruit above Kalila's lips, which were white as those of a cadaver. I was transported with joy when a living ruby returned into them beneath the dripping of the fluid, and the eyes of Kalila opened, to give back my ardent gaze. He lifted his arms from the sarcophagus to embrace me, and I quite forgot the presence of Omotakos. That personage, after a decorous interval, observed in a loud voice, "I am sorry to break in upon your reunion, since I cannot do otherwise than approve and admire the fervor which animates you, but it is more than probable that I shall have, before long, another use for the receptacle you are both occupying. For that reason, I shall conduct you to an alcove beyond my treasury. This alcove is fitted with comfortable couches that will serve your purpose fully as well. Kalila, rearing his head at the sound of Omotako's voice, perceived, for the first time, the remarkable baboon, who had hitherto been screened from his view by my bosom. He, in his turn, was no less amazed than I had been. However, heeding the injunction of our host, he got up from the sarcophagus. In low tones I begged him to repress the injudicious laughter that quivered visibly upon his countenance. We both followed Omotako's. As we went, I placed the yellow fruit in the bosom of my garment. Kalila, more impressed by the person of our guide than by the doleful surroundings, could not forbear commenting on the igneous properties of the tail, which emitted showers of sparks on the gloom, as the owner flourished it in his progress. He remarked to me, in great wonder, that the baboon seemed to experience no discomfort whatever from this unique process of combustion. Omotakos, who had overheard him, turned and said, "No, young prince, that it is the nature of my tail to burn in this manner, and the sensation it affords me is, in its degree, no more painful, or extraordinary, than that which women experience from the flushing of their checks, or men from an excitement of the blood." After a journey that appeared brief indeed, and which I could not reconcile with my former impression of the vastness of the chamber, we came to an open portal. The flambeau of Omotakos, reared aloft, illumined for us a much smaller room, with couches of golden cloth, and dark draperies. My father would have loved the draperies, since they were entirely covered with hieroglyphics, but the hieroglyphics, which appeared to change altogether from moment to moment, would have maddened the sages whom he employed. Here the djinn left us, after lighting with his torch the many lamps of brass and copper censers with which the room had been supplied. I thought that this departure was attended by an odd lack of ceremony, but recalled that he had come down from the pillar, on the occasion of his appearance before me, in a manner no less informal. Through the open doorway, Kalila and I continued, for some time, to see the luminosity that he made in his movements about the treasury. He seemed to be very busy, and we caught glimpses of certain peculiar assistants, who were bringing in a new lot of treasures. But our joy in being together once more preoccupied us so fully that we paid little heed to these activities, and were enabled to disregard, for the time being, their somewhat sinister import. Between our caresses, we asked each other 1,000 questions, and told all that had happened to us severally, since the date of our separation. Kalila was much dismayed when he learned the circumstances of my visit to the underground palace, and the promise I had made, on his behalf, to the djinn. "Alas," he said, "I fear that all this has been prearranged, and for no good purpose. The lions who attacked me were of supernatural size and fierceness. No doubt they were the very djinns of whom Omotakos told you, and after their talons had slain my followers, and had rendered me senseless, they brought me here. You, Zulkais, through your affection for me, have entered the trap. However, let us try to forget this. No matter how dark and precarious our situation, we have at least the consolation of each other's society." "All that I have done was nothing," I replied. "Gladly would I pledge myself to Eblis 1,000 times, for your sake." In such converse, the hours went by, and we began to wonder at the long absence of Omotakos, who had vanished after a while among the pillars of the treasury, and had not returned. He had left us without declaring his intentions as to our future destiny, and it seemed that he had forgotten us. Moreover, he had made no provision for us, beyond lighting the lamps and censers. By the illumination that these vessels yielded, we began to remark the moth-holes in the figured hangings, and the great age of the couches, whose coverings might have been exhumed from palaces long buried in the desert sand. We noted, also, that the lamps and censers were overspread with verdigris. The fumes of the latter vessels troubled us, being both musty and aromatic, like the bombs that exhale from the cerements of the pharaohs. We heard, at intervals, equivocal and disquieting sounds in a direction of which we were not sure. Together with all this, I grew faint with hunger, but there were no viands in the room for my regalement. At last I remembered the fruit which I had placed in my bosom, after using it to revive Kalila. Forgetful of the warning of the jinn, I drew it forth. I would have shared it with Kalila, but he, noting my hunger, declined. I devoured it greedily, finding a strange and spicy savor in its pulp. Almost immediately, I experienced a feeling of unbearable heat. An intense ardor of life rose within me, as if it would burst the confines of my heart. The chamber seemed to blaze with a light that was not that of the lamps. My senses burned with a confused delirium of desires, a madness possessed me, and Kalila was lost to my perception, like the shadows of the apartment. Then I thought that a ball of fire, hued with 1,000 colors that changed momently, swam up and floated before me in the air. An extravagant longing seized me, to possess the ball, and I sprang to my feet and tried to clasp it, but the globe eluded me, and fled swiftly, and I, without heeding the cries of Kalila, pursued it. I ran through a small portal at the rear of the chamber, and down a labyrinth of cavernous corridors, which, save for the illumination of the globe, would have been altogether lightless. Intent only on overtaking the bright ball, I did not notice my surroundings, or the route I followed. At last the light disappeared, leaving only a dim glimmer, like the afterglow of the sunken sun, and I came to the verge of a precipice. Far below, the ball receded, plunging into abysses from which the dismal and eternal roaring of lost waters came up to arrest me. However, in my delirium, I should still have followed the globe, if it had not seemed, after an interval, to return toward me from the depths. I waited ready to seize it, but, as the light drew nearer, I perceived its true source. It was Omotakos, climbing nimbly from the gulf, by means of the slight projections of the stone. In an instant, he stood beside me, and said with an air of reproof, "Princess, why this haste to fling yourself into the underground river that flows eternally toward the realms of Eblis? The destined hour of your departure thither, borne by that doleful tide, is not yet at hand. Fortunately, I met your brother, who was seeking you in the darkness of the caverns, and learning what had happened, I came without delay, by another route than yours, to intercept you. Kalila, in consideration of this act of succor, has plighted himself to the Prince of the Fiery Globe, and the Flaming Hearts. Let us rejoin him, for I fear that he still wanders, lost and distracted, in the darkness. In a sense, I am to blame for what has occurred. Carried away by the duties of my custodianship of the treasury, duties that are often exigent, I forgot the obligations of a host, and failed to provide for your natural needs. If I had done as I should, hunger would never have prompted you to devour the fruit that gave rise to your delirium. My madness had abated. I followed Omotakos, perceiving, as I went, the horrors of the labyrinth of caverns, to which the orb with the 1,000 colors had blinded me. At every turn, there were scattered bones and skeletons, which had belonged, mayhap, to wretches who had lost themselves in the maze, and had perished of famine. Some of the skeletons lay close together, but I could not tell whether the intimacy of their postures had been dictated by human love or anthropophagism. Omotakos did not enlighten me upon this point, nor did I care to question him. At last, we found Kalila, whose joy was little less extravagant than the delirium which had led me to the floating ball. I must provide more adequately for your entertainment, said Omotakos. Eblis permits me to keep you here a while, as my guests. My subterranean garden lies not far away, and in it is a pavilion, which you may occupy. Food and drink will be served regularly to you, and in plenteous quantities, and I trust that neither of you will be tempted, in view of what has occurred, to sample the fruit of my trees. He conducted us along a short passage, from which we emerged into an immense cavern whose roof was purple like the vault of night, and was starred with effulgent orbs that resembled the planets and the constellations. Here we beheld the garden of which he had spoken. It consisted of fantastic trees, heavily laden with diverse fruits and blossoms and cunningly illumined by lamps, which, very often, I could not distinguish from the fruits. In the midst was a small pavilion, built of a marble mottled with rose and black. It was furnished with luxurious divans, and a table on which delicious viands, and wines like molten ruby and topaz, had been spread for our refection. Omotacos, after again assuring us of his hospitality, begged leave to excuse himself, and departed with the same celerity that had marked his former movements. In the pavilion he had placed at our disposal, Kalila and I dwelt for a period of time that neither of us could calculate. That period, however, in spite of certain forebodings, was the happiest we had known since our childhood days when the Emir was still content to leave us together without interruption. In that place, there was no difference between day and night, for the lamps burned eternally amid the fruited foliage, and the star-like ores continued to sparkle ever in the vault above us. Often we wandered through the garden, which had a strange beauty, though we did not care, after certain indiscreet delvings, to examine too closely into its hidden particulars. The odors of the blossoms, richer than myrrh and santal, conduced to an agreeable languor, and since the Jinn supplied us with an infinity of savorous foods, and wines more delicate than those of Persia, we were well content to leave his fruits alone. In the happiness of being together, and in transports renewed perpetually, we almost forgot the rash pledges we had given. Nor were we troubled overmuch by the fact that the attendants who served us were invisible, and gave proof of their presence only by a sound that resembled the noise made by the flittering of great bats. Also, for the most part, we found ourselves able to ignore a sullen roaring that pervaded the garden continually, seeming to issue from subterranean waters, at a vague distance, and in a direction of which we were never sure. Indeed, we became so accustomed to the sound, mournful and menacing though it was, that it seemed to us little more than a quality of the silence in which we were sequestered. Our host, who was no doubt busily engaged with the care of his acquisitions, and the treasure confided to him by the Kabbalist rulers, failed to visit us again. We remarked his negligence, but under the circumstances, we did not miss him. Alas, though we knew it not, or strove to forget it, the malign forces of our destiny were always at work. Our sojourn in the garden of Omotacos was to have a frightful denouement. By virtue of the allegiance we had both pledged to the Lord of Evil, we were to share, at the appointed time, the fate of all others who have thus damned themselves irretrievably. And yet, in order to live again those happy hours, I, and Kalila, too, would repeat the same bond without hesitation. Dream not that we repent. We were plighting other vows, as we had done 1,000 times, and were seated upon a divan in the pavilion, when the date of perdition arrived. It came without announcement, save an insupportable thunder, that seemed to rive apart the foundations of the world. We were tossed as if by earthquake, the air darkened around us, and the ground gave way. Clasped in each other's arms, we had the sensation of falling, together with the pavilion, into a deep abyss. The thunder ceased, the vertigo of our descent grew less, and we heard on every side the woeful and furious noise of rushing waters. A melancholy glimmering dawned about us, and by it, we saw the pavilion had become a raft of serpents plaited together in the fashion of reeds, that was borne headlong on a dark tumultuous river. The serpents, large and rigid as beams of wood, had preserved on their skins the black and rosy mottling of the marble, and they had formed themselves into a cabin around us, like the superstructure of the pavilion. As we went, they added a loud and sinister hissing to the sound of the driven waters. In this horrible manner, we were carried through unfathomable caves, ever deeper, toward the accursed realms of Eblis. Night surrounded us, we beheld no longer the least ray or glimmer, and clasped tightly in each other's embrace, we sought by means of such contact to mitigate the noisome clamminess of the reptiles, and the terror of our situation. Thus we seemed to go on for a length of time that was equivalent to many days. At last, a light broke upon us, lurid and doleful, and the clamor of the river deepened, with a thunder of mighty waterfalls before us. We thought surely that the torrent would precipitate us over some fatal verge, but at this point, The serpents of our raft began to exert themselves, and swimming vigorously, they landed us in the halls of Eblis, not far from that place where the Sultan Solomon listens eternally to the tumult of the cataract, and waits for the release that will come to him only with its cessation. After that, preserving no longer the form of a raft, they re-entered the stream, and swam back separately, in the direction of the garden of Omotakos. Now, Lord, we await, even as you, the moment when our hearts shall be kindled with the unconsuming fire, and shall burn brightly as the tail of the baboon, but, alas, shall derive unutterable anguish, like the hearts of all other mortals, from that flame in which is the ecstasy of demons. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.